Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. We are now in day 33 of the ongoing war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and obviously the fighting continues unabated. Today we're going to start first within the Kiev area of operations. We continue to see the Ukrainians attempt limited counterattacks, specifically within the last 24, 48 hours. They are attacking within the area of Brovary, this area, as you can see on the map. They have been successful, meaning the Ukrainian military, has been successful in pushing back Russian forces, at least within the vicinity of Brovary. We continue to see limited operations as well on the western side of the Dnieper River in efforts to attempt to cut off Russian forces near the Anatov air base, and obviously operating within the Hostomel area of operations. Now, we do understand that it would appear the Russians have reinforced some of their forces in these areas and are preventing further counterattacks by the Ukrainian military, especially in the western Kiev sector of operations. We continue to see the Russian military launch attacks and offensive operations within the vicinity of Chernihiv. Again, for all intents and purposes, Chernihiv has been encircled. Again, very, very difficult for Chernihiv to receive additional supplies and resources, given the what would appear to almost be somewhat of a double envelopment. The only real route into Chernihiv, obviously, is kind of, if you look at my cursor here, is kind of up this route, and then they almost have to go around Russian forces that have encircled Chernihiv from the south. Now, the problem with that is this road obviously takes you very, very close to Russian forces. Also, it is quite possible that the main bridge into the south of town, or the two main bridges into the south of town, may have in fact been destroyed, which is now even has more isolated Chernihiv in terms of the Ukrainians being able to resupply in terms of the resupply efforts. Sounds like right now also the military commander of the Eastern Military District has taken control of operations within the area of Kiev. That leads us to believe that the Russians have not abandoned their prospects of eventually circumventing and enveloping Kiev. We also understand that an additional 10 battalion tactical groups have been brought in, but at the same time, the Russians are also withdrawing some of its units that have taken high rates of casualties in some of these battalions that have been severely damaged in the ensuing fighting, and they've withdrawn some of these forces into Belarus up towards Chernobyl to rest and refit, and we anticipate to be then redeployed at a later date. But again, we are seeing additional elements of the Russian military being brought in to support that endeavor in terms of having the ability to withdraw some of these Russian troops from the line of contact, bring in additional forces to hold the line, and quite possibly once the Ukrainians got wind of that, that's when we kind of saw these counterattacks started taking place, especially in the vicinity of northwest of Kiev. But again, you can kind of see for yourself what we believe is relatively accurate in terms of what we're looking at on the ground. Again, not the best situation for the Russians at this point. Again, as they continue to drive and encircle Kiev, they're going to end up facing the challenge of again facing off against forces and a very vast array of forces of the Ukrainian military that are going to be positioned inside of Kiev, and at the same time, on the outside of this encirclement, they're going to be facing additional forces from the Ukrainian military that could be attacking both from the south and the west as well. And again, a very, very challenging environment for the Russian military at this point. We continue to see the Ukrainians launch limited counterattacks within the vicinity of Sumy. The lines near Sumy for the Ukrainians appear to be holding. And in fact, we continue to see Ukrainian forces launch limited counterattacks within that area of operation. And again, you would also define the Sumy area of operations for the Russians as more or less a supporting operation for the advance on Kiev. And again, as you can see, the Russians are still focusing on, at times, circling and cutting off some of these towns, and then reducing those towns in terms of opposing forces that may be located inside of those towns. We continue to see heavy shelling and attacks occurring near Kharkiv. Again, the Russians are not encircling that town at this point. We are not seeing major Russian operations taking place in terms of efforts to encircle and or storm the town, as we did in the early days of the conflict. Again, we saw those reconnaissance and force efforts with the Spetsnaz units and some VDV units and reconnaissance units being supported with some elements of some heavy formations, tanks, armored infantry fighting vehicles. But again, that proved to be very, very difficult as it got closer and closer, as those Russian forces got closer and closer to the heavy built-up areas of Kharkiv. And again, as you can see, an enormous city with blocks and blocks and blocks of very large apartment buildings and apartment structure. And again, a lot of these are of the old Soviet design, so they're constructed, again, concrete and again, really kind of designed at times to withstand some of the attacks that we've seen. And each one of these buildings, and again, can be used as sniper nests, and obviously areas where the Ukrainians can deploy anti-tank guided weapon systems on top of these buildings and inside of these buildings as the Russians attempt to advance, and even making it more difficult. You have forests that surround the area of operations as well. So an incredibly difficult operation for the Russians to attempt offensive operations. And not only that, you obviously have a very well-built subway system where Ukrainian forces can move around the city, under the city at leisure, and in all probability, we're seeing probably additional tunnels and construction being conducted by the Ukrainians in terms of fortifying the Kharkiv city as well. We continue to see the Russians advance along the what we would define as the Luhansk Donetsk line. Again, as I had talked about the last few days, nothing major in terms of the seizure of large amounts of territory, but they do continue to advance at a fairly steady rate in that 3 to 8 kilometers per day within the vicinity of that Luhansk Donetsk area of operations. In terms of Mariupol, we continue to see the Russians advance, and again, this map has not been updated from yesterday. Not a lot has changed, other than I would say the line of contact by the Russians has been pushed up towards the main river that separates Mariupol. So you could say this Russian line has been pushed up to about here. And again, the Russians look like at this point the focus is to split the western half of Mariupol into two, and then work on each area individually in terms of eventually reducing and destroying Ukrainian military units inside of Mariupol. Again, probably not too far off until the Russians directly and completely control the town of Mariupol. Furthermore, we continue to hear about partisan activity taking place in the town of Kherson. At one point, it was being talked about that the possibility that the town was disputed, meaning that Ukrainian forces could actually control parts of Kherson. Again, we don't think that is the case. we do believe that Ukrainian partisans are very much active inside of Kherson, and in fact, they're probably very much active in other parts of areas of the occupied areas of Ukraine as well. But compounding this issue of partisan activity inside of Kherson, we continue to see Ukrainian military efforts attempting to push in a south by southwesterly direction towards the main Russian lines near Kherson, as you can clearly see here. Again, the blue are advance routes for the Ukrainian military, and obviously the areas in red and or the orange are the routes of Russian movements as well. So again, it would appear that the Russians have not abandoned their efforts for the west bank of the western portions of the Dnieper River. It appears they've just at this point have put operations on hold until they can properly reduce forces within the confines of Mariupol and continue to advance more or less and consolidate control again more around the western areas of the eastern side of the Dnieper River again. And we think at this point right now, the Russians are looking for three operational objectives right now. We still don't believe that they have vacated their plans near Kiev. And again, I also believe that the operations towards Kiev is also designed to hold down Ukrainian forces that could also be deployed along the eastern bank, the eastern side of the Dnieper River. So strategically, that completely makes sense, as the Russians would rather face less Ukrainian forces on the eastern bank and have some of those forces tied up in the north near Kiev. Now, at the same time, the Russians appear to be very, very much focused on taking all the territory on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. That would be objective number one, and probably their primary objective at this point. After that, again, you have two ancillary objectives that the Russians may look at completing. One is I do believe that the military operations in the direction of Kiev are still very much on the table, depending on how things continue to go on the eastern bank of the Dnieper River. And at the same time, the Russians still would like very, very much to make a move again and control all of the territory along the Black Sea, and basically make Ukraine a landlocked state if we're looking at a two-state solution, meaning we have a West Ukraine and a Eastern Ukraine, which is looking more and more probable each day as this conflict continues. I think we're probably more likely than not looking at a situation where the Russians attempt to create a Eastern Ukraine, or at some point annex all of the territory that is east of the Dnieper River. That looks like a war goal at this point, or a war aim at this point. And again, we have heard discussions, especially in Luhansk, where there could be an eventual referendum where at least Luhansk seeks to actually join the Russian Federation and become part of the Russian Federation at some point. Obviously, currently, that's not the case. However, with that being said, both the Luhansk and Donetsk militia groups, army groups, whatever you want to call them, they were, prior to hostilities, they were broken down into two separate corps. You had the Luhansk Corps and the Donetsk Corps, and many of those combat brigades of those two corps had Russian officers commanding many of those brigade combat elements. You still do have paramilitary units that have local command and control, but again, more and more we were seeing more and more Russian units or Russian staff officers controlling many of these brigade combat elements that were in the Donetsk and Luhansk republics. And again, more and more, we're starting to see those militia units actually becoming more or less part of the Russian military as this conflict continues. But I think again, right now, the main goal of the Russian forces is the eastern portion of the Dnieper River, while Russian forces continue to tie down Ukrainian forces near Kiev and make the Ukrainians designate forces to defend Kiev as opposed to defending the eastern bank of the Dnieper River, and then finally continuing to hold areas on the western bank of the Dnieper River for possible future operations that could take the Russians towards Odessa. I think we're a long way off from that from happening, but I do think the Russian military, the Russian political apparatus, really wants to see the ability to access the Russian forces that are based in Moldova. And again, I think eventually that could happen, again, depending on what happens in the operations that take place in eastern Ukraine. If the Russians are not able to fully consolidate control over eastern Ukraine, meaning east of the Dnieper River, it is going to be very, very difficult for the Russians to advance on Odessa and seize control of Odessa. That is going to be incredibly difficult. And again, just the difficulty in seizing control of the eastern half of Ukraine, including cities such as Kharkiv, cities such as Poltava, and other areas such as they have already seized, such as Mariupol, have been very, very, very difficult. And the one thing I would like to note is a lot is being said about the Russian military in terms of capabilities and proficiencies directly correlating to this operation that they are conducting, meaning the Russians are conducting in Ukraine. Now, with that being said, it has to be noted, and it has to be at least looked at very, very closely in terms of the just how challenging this operation was. And again, if you compare and contrast the United States invasion of Iraq, meaning the march up from Kuwait up towards Baghdad, the Iraqi army was much less proficient than the army of Ukraine. So again, the Russians are fighting a far more capable opponent in terms of the Ukrainian forces. And I would venture to say that the Ukrainian forces probably, at least in terms of tenacity and effort, would be on par with a Russian invasion of Poland. And I think what we're seeing now in terms of the combat effectiveness of Ukrainian forces, again, probably would be very much on par with what the Russians would see if they were to invade Poland. Now, I understand that you would then most likely see direct NATO intervention if the Russians were to invade Poland. But again, for all intents and purposes, NATO is directly supporting the Ukrainian military. And again, that is in terms of both supplies, weapons, infrastructure, food, resources, money, everything with the exception, and even manpower. I mean, even we are seeing elements of some of these armed forces in the West basically going over and joining some of these volunteer units and assisting the Ukrainians directly. At the same time, we're also, in all probability, also seeing elements of the United States Central Intelligence Agency and Special Operations Forces from the West, quite possibly directly assisting the Ukrainians on the ground. We know for a fact there are Americans on the ground in Ukraine fighting Russians at this moment. There's absolute video evidence that has taken place. and many of these individuals, in fact, have some fairly significant military experience as well. So again, the type of operation that the Russians are having to conduct Ukraine far outweighs the challenge that the United States was going up against inside of Iraq. Again, Ukraine, much bigger country, much larger population, better equipped from a military standpoint, and the terrain is a lot different too. Again, you were talking about in terms of Iraq, again, a lot of flat open desert with some very large built up urban areas, with some what you would define as kind of a tropical area, but very few in terms of that sort of terrain inside of Iraq. So again, in Ukraine, forested, heavy urban areas, very cold at this point. A lot more terrain features in terms of rivers to circumnavigate and try to pass over. Again, just a much more challenging environment than the type of environment the United States saw inside of Iraq, and especially the very first parts of the early 4 weeks of the initial invasion. Roughly the same sort of force construct in terms of size of forces, and the Russians probably didn't commit initially near enough forces to make this a successful operation, considering just how much territory they initially went after. And I think they're now learning their lessons in terms of they quite possibly bit off more than they can chew. I understand the premise of they launched this operation towards Kiev to kind of bog down Ukrainian forces to make the advance on eastern Ukraine more successful. Not completely buying that. I think there was a concerted effort to go after Kiev, and unfortunately for the Russians, that has failed, at least initially. Now, could we see something change in the near future? Quite possibly. We continue to see the Russians very much active and are still in this fight and continue to fight and continue to bomb and launch cruise missiles. And we are also starting to see the Ukrainians start, at least on the surface in some cases, to wilt under this incredible pressure of this deep battle doctrine that we are seeing from the Russians. Again, the Russians are continuing to attack. Nothing has really changed from that viewpoint. It continues and will probably continue for some time, unfortunately, for the Ukrainians. Again, the Ukrainians were able to mount a very tenacious resistance in the first 30 days. But are they going to be able to continue to resist when we get into day 60, day 90, and quite possibly beyond, if in fact the war goes longer than that? And traditionally speaking, in terms of large wars like we're seeing in the one that we're currently seeing, they often last much longer than what we have seen in some of these smaller conflicts around the globe. Until recently, until this invasion of Ukraine. So we'll have to see what happens. Again, the fighting continues, and we'll continue to obviously monitor and report the events on the ground. And we may have more information in the form of content very soon. Have a good day, everybody. Thanks for joining us.